Picture this for a second. You're staring out into just an endless, relentless expanse of deep blue ocean. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're going to unpack the true, honestly mind-blowing story of Rapa Nui. We're stepping back in time to a fateful, entirely uncharted voyage in April of 1722, and we're going to look at a society that didn't just barely survive, but actually engineered an absolute masterpiece of civilization in literally one of the most punishingly isolated environments on planet Earth. So let's dive right in. So set the scene. It's 1722. An expedition of exhausted Dutch sailors, led by an explorer named Jacob Roggeveen, had been navigating the vast, empty South Pacific for 17 grueling days. Now, they were actually hunting for a legendary, massive southern continent that mapmakers back then were absolutely certain existed. But what they found on Easter Sunday wasn't some sprawling landmass. Boom! Out of the ocean mist appears this tiny, incredibly isolated, triangular rock. Roggeveen named it Passe Island, or Easter Island. But I'll tell you, the moment they dropped anchor, the terrain itself was the absolute least interesting thing in front of them. In his journal, Roggeveen wrote that his men were, quote, struck with astonishment. And you can totally see why. These explorers weren't looking at lush forests or, bustling ports. They were staring at a coastline where dozens of massive, 30-foot human-like stone giants were silhouetted against the sky. I mean, imagine being a weary 18th century sailor, arriving at what feels like the literal edge of the world, and being greeted by these towering stone sentinels just staring blankly out to sea. It was a profound mystery back then, and honestly, it remains one of history's most fascinating puzzles today. To really wrap our heads around what the Dutch stumbled upon, we have to talk about geography, and one staggering number, 1,200. That is how many miles Rapa Nui is from the nearest inhabited landmass, Pitcairn Island. To put that in perspective, that's like driving from New York to Florida with absolutely nothing but open ocean around you. Rapa Nui is quite literally one of the most remote inhabited places on the entire planet. It exists completely outside the normal flow of ancient human geography, which begs this massive, glaring question. How in the world did an ancient civilization, cut off from the rest of humanity by thousands of miles of deep water, manage to build what they did? Well, before we get into the how, we really need to understand the why. To the islanders, these towering statues, which are called the Moai, they weren't just massive art projects, and they definitely weren't monuments to human ego. They were vessels for something called mana. Mana basically translates to spiritual power or secret energy. So the Moai were deeply vital spiritual guardians. They represented deified ancestors, acting as this physical bridge between the living community and the powerful spirits of their forebears. They were the spiritual anchors of an incredibly complex society. And it was that intense spiritual devotion that drove some of the most baffling engineering feats in human history. Just consider the weight for a second. 80 tons! Guys, that is the weight of a fully loaded space shuttle. It completely boggles the mind how an isolated civilization with zero draft animals, without the invention of the wheel, and obviously lacking any modern machinery, managed to carve these behemoths out of solid volcanic rock. But here's the crazy part. The carving was just the beginning. The real engineering marvel was the transport. For decades, experts just assumed they rolled them on logs, right? Because that conveniently fit this whole idea that they cut down all their trees. But modern engineers have uncovered a way more sophisticated reality. They used a complex system of tension ropes. They deliberately designed the statues with a low center of gravity and a forward lean. By pulling 3 sets of ropes, the islanders could literally walk these massive statues upright across miles of rugged island terrain. It was an absolute masterclass in applied physics, kinetic energy, and leverage. They harnessed human rhythm to move mountains. But the mystery of how they built them is often overshadowed by the mystery of what supposedly happened to the builders. For a very long time, the world looked at these silent stone figures, looked at the barren landscape of later centuries, and saw only a tragedy, a story of self-destruction. This is known as the collapse theory, a tale of ecocide and total ruin. But as modern science and archaeology are digging deeper, we are actively rewriting the script in favor of the resilience theory. And this is a story of incredible adaptation and genius-level environmental engineering. First, let's unpack that old myth. The widely accepted collapse hypothesis paints a remarkably grim picture. The story goes that a thriving Rapa Nui society got a little too obsessed, grew too fast, and drastically overexploited its finite resources. In the relentless drive to build bigger and bigger Moai, they supposedly clear-cut every single palm tree on the island. The narrative says that without the tree roots, massive soil erosion took hold. Topsoil washed into the sea, farms failed, and the resulting famine plunged the society into violent civil war, cannibalism, and mass starvation. It's a super dramatic story, and it's often used as a cautionary tale for our own planet's future.
It's a great story for a movie, for sure, but we really have to stop and ask ourselves, is this whole ecocide narrative actually accurate? Or is it just a massive, tragic misunderstanding of a brilliantly resilient people? I mean, what if the barren landscape wasn't the result of foolish destruction, but just a really harsh baseline reality that these people actually managed to conquer?
And this is exactly where modern science steps in to set the record straight. Recent archaeological findings completely pivot the story away from collapse, pushing it toward extreme human adaptation. When scientists actually started looking at the soil chemistry, the agricultural remains, and the island's ecological timeline, the data just did not support a sudden self-inflicted societal suicide. Instead, they found evidence of a civilization that looked at a naturally degrading, harsh environment and used rigorous scientific ingenuity to survive it. This is where the Rapa Nui truly shine as brilliant ancient engineers. They used a process called lithic mulching. Now, to understand the genius here, you have to understand the environment. Rapa Nui's soil was inherently pretty terrible. It had been heavily leached of nutrients by rainfall over hundreds of thousands of years, and it was constantly getting battered by salty, erosive ocean winds. So what did the islanders do? They actively engineered their environment on a massive scale. First, they systematically quarried and broke up volcanic basalt rocks. Second, they meticulously laid millions of these rocks across huge expanses of farmland, eventually covering nearly half the island. Scientifically speaking, this is absolute genius. These rocks created a vital thermal mass, absorbing heat during the day and releasing it at night to protect fragile crops from extreme temperature shifts. They also acted as a physical barrier against the wind, trapping moisture in the dirt and stopping evaporation from that intense Pacific sun. But the most critical scientific mechanism was chemical. As these rough volcanic rocks weathered under the rain, they acted as a slow-release fertilizer. They continuously leached vital macronutrients, specifically phosphorus and potassium, directly into the depleted earth, literally regenerating the topsoil. This wasn't the desperate flailing of a dying society. This was an advanced agricultural science lab, operating right in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. They essentially hacked their own ecosystem to ensure their survival. So the crucial takeaway here is that their real legacy is one of absolute resilience. Beyond their brilliant rock mulch agriculture, they showed incredibly sophisticated survival skills. They had the advanced astronomical and hydrodynamic knowledge required for precision ocean navigation across vast empty waters. And perhaps most tragically, when we look at the actual demographic collapse of Rapa Nui, it wasn't some internal ecocide. The massive population drop was largely driven by the devastating impact of outside diseases introduced by European contact, followed by a horrific 19th century slave trade that forcefully abducted a huge portion of their working population to South America. The true marvel is that despite these apocalyptic external forces, the Rapa Nui culture, their language, and their bloodline actually survived. Which brings us right back to the giants. When we reframe the history, the Moai take on a completely different meaning, don't they? They weren't vanity projects of a society going mad and destroying its home. They were the heartbeat of a community. They were the ultimate proof of a people who stared out into the vast, lonely, endless blue of the Pacific Ocean, fully aware of their extreme isolation, and decided with absolute certainty: we will not be forgotten. They built testaments to their ancestors that have literally outlasted empires. As we wrap up this explainer, we're really left to ponder the enduring human spirit. When you look at their incredible engineering, their absolute mastery of agricultural science, and their sheer survival against practically impossible odds, the mystery of Rapa Nui isn't how they fell, it's how they stood for so long. Looking at those silent giants today, we have to ask ourselves, what does their resilience teach us about our own capacity to adapt? And why, centuries later, do these stones refuse to be silenced? Think about that the next time you hear a story about a society supposedly destined to fail. Thanks for hanging out with us, and until next time, keep questioning the narrative.